Hi, I'm Linda Silverman, and I'm so happy to be with you today. And Greed has asked me to talk about my legacy, which is a little embarrassing, but we'll see how that goes. Um, I've always been passionate about the gifted. I actually knew what I wanted to do with my life when I was 17 years old. That's a picture of me at 17. And I believe that I'm here on a mission and that my matron saint, Lita Hollingworth, who started the field, she was a child-centered psychologist, and she died 2 years before I was born. But I feel like this is a calling for me, and that it was Lita Hollingworth who called me. And if you don't know who she was born in an earthen dugout in Nebraska on May 25th, 1886. And she became the founder and matriarch of our field. She wrote the first textbook. She taught the first course at Columbia University. She was the first counselor of the gifted. She developed child-centered therapy and taught Carl Rogers, who piggybacked on it for his client-centered therapy. She developed emotional education for the gifted. She conducted 30 studies. She wrote the book Children Above 180 IQ, and she invented above-level testing to test children who were way beyond the norms for kids their age. She developed programs for the highly gifted, and she developed what we call curriculum compacting, which is doing a whole lot of curriculum in a smaller amount of time, but she called it compressing. So many of the ideas that we use in gifted education were developed by Lita Hollingworth. She was also an ardent feminist, the scientific bulwark of the women's movement, and she gave women the right to vote in the United States. She created what is known as the woman question: how gifted women can fulfill their own potential and still be mothers and help their children fulfill their potential. So I got my PhD in special education and educational psychology at the University of Southern California. And I was the coordinator of gifted education at the University of Denver for 9 years, from 1976 until 1985. I also taught half-time in counseling psychology. And I presented in 12 countries and 43 of the United States. We have about 36 YouTube presentations. And I've contributed about 500 articles, chapters, and books on giftedness. In 1979, which was a really important year for me, I developed the Gifted Development Center, but it wasn't called that at the time. It was called the Gifted Child Testing Service, and it was at the University of Denver. But then something pretty awful happened. The beautiful, beautiful building that we were in was burnt to the ground, Bucktel Chapel. And so we had to take Gifted Child Testing Service off campus. And then eventually it became the Gifted Development Center. And then this is what it looks like today. So we have almost 46 years of experience assessing gifted and twice exceptional children. Our anniversary is in June. We've assessed more than 6,600 children from all over the world. We have the largest database on exceptionally and profoundly gifted children, at least 1,000. We're a training and research center, internationally recognized, and I like to believe that we have the gold standard in assessment of the gifted. Also in 1979, I was introduced to Dabrowski's theory when I was asked to review a brand new book, New Voices in Counseling the Gifted. And this happened quite fortuitously when I got on a plane to my very first National Association for Gifted Children conference. And I sat next to a man who looked like "Don't talk to me" written all over him. But I could tell he was a psychologist, and I couldn't resist. And I said, "Hi, are you a psychologist? I'm a psychologist too. And I study the gifted." And when he heard gifted, he got interested because he had just been given the book New Voices in Counseling the Gifted, but he knew absolutely no one who could review it. And it was Sam Ossipow, who was the editor of Contemporary Psychology, which reviews all these books in psychology. So I said I would do it because I was a bit annoyed that I hadn't written the first book. But I needed a book for my Counseling the Gifted course at the University of Denver. So I said, yes, I would do it. And then Michael Piechowski had written the second chapter on developmental potential, which introduced Dabrowski's theory to gifted education. And Nick Colangelo, who was one of the editors of the book, his wife wrote another chapter on using Dabrowski's theory as a means of counseling a college student. So those two chapters introduced me to Dabrowski's theory. I was smitten right off the bat and immediately told Frank Falk about it, who had become a good friend of mine at the University of Denver. And he read about the theory in Michael's chapter, and the two of us decided together that we were going to create the Dabrowski Study Group. But this is a picture of Michael Piechowski when he was first introduced to Dr. Kazimierz Dąbrowski at the University of Alberta. And then here's a picture of Frank and me. Frank was the chair of the sociology department, and I was coordinator of the gifted education program. And we created the Dabrowski Study Group in 1980 until about 1987. It continued after that, but Frank left the university at that time. And when Frank was leaving, he was given a buyout right after Bucktel Chapel burned down. They closed down the gifted education graduate program. So I lost my job. Frank was offered a buyout because he was getting paid too much money. A whole lot of people were offered buyouts. And at the same time, Michael Piechowski also left Northwestern University. And what we had done in those 6 or 7 years that we met weekly is we created all kinds of papers and conference presentations and publications and instruments. And we had graduate students who were doing their doctorates and master's thesis on Dabrowski's theory. And all of a sudden it was going to come to a screeching halt. Well, after Frank left, there were several people in the group who had been editors. And what we were doing at that time was comparing Dabrowski's theory to all these other theories of advanced development. And we came up with the idea of creating a journal. And we needed a logo. And someone in the group had actually envisioned this logo. And it was a vision that came to him after I explained that I had a vision of this brick building, and it had a sign on the door, a brass plaque that said Institute for the Study of Advanced Development. And after I told him that, he created this logo. So we've been using that logo ever since. And we became a public nonprofit organization in 1987. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the Institute, because most people know much more about Gifted Development Center, but the Institute's pretty important. It's a nonprofit education and research corporation directed toward uncovering the abilities of underserved populations, studying advanced development in children, and fostering undeveloped potential in women. Unlike the traditional view of adult giftedness as high levels of productivity and creativity, Izad's view of advanced development involves the deepening of the personality, strengthening of one's values, broadening of one's scope of responsibility, consciousness of the meaning of one's existence, concern for others, and commitment to service. Very Dabrowskian. So IZAD, as we call it, focuses on issues of adult giftedness. We conduct research, we provide workshops, we have sponsored Dabrowski congresses, and we publish Advanced Development, a peer-reviewed journal on giftedness in adults. IZAD was born of interest and study of Dabrowski's theory of positive disintegration, a broad theory of possible human development with important implications for gifted adults. This is what our journal looked like for the first 12 years of its production. Now it's an e-journal, but it's the official publication of the Institute, the only journal on giftedness in adults, and our first volume was released in 1989. Our journal gave birth to the whole field of counseling the gifted adult. This is brand new territory, and I was so pleased when I went on Google because I was looking for a picture of a gifted adult, and I just put gifted adult in Google and found tons in Google Images, and I found tons of pictures and opportunities and services and internet connections for gifted adults. None of that existed before advanced development. We have a new feature that we'd like to tell you about and encourage you to write an article for. We're now seeking shorter pieces for uncommon ground, under 1,500 words, that draw on the author's personal knowledge and experience and give readers a stimulating new perspective or tool. So if that interests you and you'd like to get published, we're really looking for articles for that new feature. We have 5 main categories of articles that we publish: theory, Dabrowski's theory, other theories of advanced development, moral exemplars, research on gifted adults, issues of giftedness in adults, and counseling and therapy. We also publish poetry. So if you're a poet and you'd like to submit poetry, we're always looking for new poetry. We publish case studies, short stories, essays, book reviews, artwork, comments or responses to previous articles, and rejoinders. So send us your poetry. To date, we published 104 poems, and Bruce Allen is our poetry editor. And in keeping with our focus on undeveloped potential in gifted women, most of our published authors in advanced development have been female, 91 female to 37 male. And that's quite different from the other journals in gifted education. So these are the things that I've been involved in. I founded POGO, that they call themselves that. It stands for Parents of Gifted Offspring. But it was for parents of children who scored in the 160 plus IQ range. And I did that at the University of Denver in 1985. I also co-founded with my husband the Gylanic Center in 1994, which is a healing center. And Gylany means equal partnership between the masculine and the feminine in the world and in yourself, because we all have masculine and feminine elements. I founded the Institute for the Study of Advanced Development in 1987, and I founded the journal Advanced Development in 1989. We resurrected the Dabrowski Study Group in 2014, and this is a picture of a party we had at my house. Michael is standing in the back on the left, next to Diana Howard and next to me. And he came to Denver to visit me, and we had a party for him at my house. And that's Frank Bulk sitting next to Chris Wells and Betty Maxwell, who was the associate director of Gifted Development Center for at least 10 years. And then she became the editor of Advanced Development after me. And then Nancy Miller, who's standing in the back on the right-hand side, she is the editor now. And Michael is the associate editor. And next to Nancy is Kathy Jones, who's the assistant editor. Also in 1989, I founded a newsletter called Understanding Our Gifted. And in 1989, our POGO group decided they wanted to conduct research on children in the 160 range. So between 1989 and 2000, we conducted 2 pilot studies. In 1991, I was one of the founders of the Columbus Group. And in 1992, I founded the Visual Spatial Learners Study Group. PG Retreat was a summer program that was started by the POGO group. It was for the same population, children who test in the 160 IQ range or above. And that was begun in Colorado in 2002. We've had children from all over the world attend the PG Retreat. I founded the International Network of Child-Centered Advocates in 2005. And GREED is part of that network. We have individuals in New Zealand, Australia, the Philippines, Canada, Hong Kong. It's a very lively group of people who really understand that child-centered, importance of child-centeredness and gifted education. I also put on the first conference, the first symposium on adult giftedness in 2011. And that was the Gifted Journey, Hardwired for Life. And then in 2017, I founded the Child-Centered Collective. And we decided in that group that we were going to come to Europe to learn the world game. And Greed invited us to her home and invited Marianne van de Koolbeek, who is on the right, and all of us descended upon her, and Greet made room for all of us in her home. And we had the most glorious, glorious time learning the world game and getting certified and developing lifelong relationships. It was a wonderful experience. In 2020, during the pandemic, the Child-Centered Gifted Consortium began, and Sandy Wolam had the idea of it. She was the head of Seabury School in Tacoma, Washington at the time. And she was trying to figure out how to deal with distance learning for gifted children at her school during the pandemic. But after the pandemic, we continue to meet and to forge a document on what exactly is child-centered gifted education. And how do you develop a school that's truly child-centered? How do you train teachers? How do you assess for it? So all of that's happened since 2020, the last 5 years. And the most recent thing that I did was I created and taught Foundations of Gifted Assessment, a 28-hour graduate course for the Institute in 2024. And Greed and Johnny, Greed's husband, who both founded the Gifted Institute in Denmark, participated in that training. And I will have videotapes available, hopefully in the next 6 months. So this was the cover of all of our 14 weeks. It went from January to July, every other week. When I was speaking at Linwood, a optometry center of all places, that invited me to speak, the Alderwood Vision Therapy Center. And a parent had picked me up in Seattle and was driving me there. And instead of asking me, how did you get into this field, which is what 7,000 people have asked me, she asked me the best question ever. She said, what was the most surprising thing that ever happened to you in your career? And I instantly knew what the answer to that was. I said, test constructors took me seriously because I never thought it would happen. I was still keeping the old Stanford Binet LM alive well after everyone in the United States had given up on it, because it was the only IQ test that went into the 200 range. And what we were measuring on the Wechsler scales and all the modern tests, the Kaufman tests, were children that I considered to be 6 feet tall with 5-foot rulers. The highest possible score you could get on a Wechsler scale was 160, but you really couldn't get that because the verbal composite, you could get a 155. The perceptual reasoning, you could get a 155. On the working memory, you could only get 150. And on processing speed, you could only get 150. We had tested 1,000 children who tested above 160, and the modern tests couldn't test them. So I was trying to get people's attention. And to my complete shock, I ended up getting the attention of John Wasserman, who was the project director on the Stanford Binet 5th edition. So that was the first entree into advising test constructors and them coming to me for information about giftedness in developing IQ tests. I was put on the advisory panel of the 5th edition of the Stanford Binet, and I'm also on the advisory panel of the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale from Pearson. I was able, with my colleagues, to convince Pearson Assessments to create extended norms for the highly gifted for both the WISC-4 and the WISC-5. And then I have this wonderful story to tell you about the gifted index, which is probably something you've never heard of. But this was a vision that came to me in the middle of the night, really. It was like 4 in the morning, and I'm a good sleeper, and I like to sleep till 8 in the morning. But at 4 in the morning, all of a sudden, I was wide awake with the answer to a question that had been bugging me for months and months and months. I wondered how we could actually find gifted children on the WISC-5, because there were a lot of reasons why they were getting a lot lower scores than they were on the WISC-4. And then I just saw it. What I saw was we could administer all 4 verbal subtests. Right now, the core verbal subtests are similarities and vocabulary. And the optional subtests are information and comprehension, which most psychologists do not administer. But you need all 4 to get the gifted index. And then 2 visual spatial tests. One of them was in the visual spatial index, the block design, and the other was in the fluid reasoning index, matrix reasoning. But that's also what I consider a visual spatial test. And then 2 mathematical tests, figure weights, which is visual, and arithmetic, which is auditory. That combination I saw would find gifted children. I called it the gifted index, but Susie Rayford, the test constructor, said Pearson would never buy that. So they called it the expanded general ability index because it was the general ability index with the inclusion of 3 optional tests: comprehension, information, and arithmetic. And what's brilliant about the general ability index is that it eliminates working memory and processing speed, which is the best thing for gifted kids because those are their lowest scores, and verbal are their highest scores. And in our studies of 390 gifted children on the WISC-5 across the country, we found that the verbal expanded crystallized ability made up of all 4 verbal subtests with the highest score, and the EGAI, the gifted index, was the second highest score for that entire group. The other thing that I was asked to do by John Wasserman was put together a gifted summit for the developers of the Stanford Binet 5. And so I brought together the leaders in the assessment of the gifted around the country and hosted a gifted summit for Dick Woodcock, who's the guy who did the Woodcock Johnson, and he was originally an author of the Stanford Binet 5, Gail Royd, who ended up being the author, and John Wasserman, who was the project director, on June 16th, 2000. And then with the help of some folks in California, I created a full day pre-conference for the World Council for Gifted and Talented Children 20th Biennial Conference in New Orleans, called an Overview of Issues of Assessing Gifted Children, the first symposium on assessment of gifted children. That was held August 7th, 2005. And then Bobby Gilman, who was our associate director, put together a signature session for the National Association for Gifted Children. The signature session is like a keynote address. It's a mini keynote. And it was called Exploring Ideal Elements of Tests of Ability for Gifted Students. And it involved the movers and shakers in gifted identification and assessment. And that was in Atlanta, Georgia in 2010. And then Linda Levitin and I put together a second national symposium on assessing gifted learners in Van Nuys on March 27th, 2009. And it influenced Alan Kaufman, who has developed many IQ tests with his wife, Nadine, and Tom Caton, who was the director of clinical assessments at Pearson. And a lot of examiners came to that. And then we organized another gifted summit in Austin for Don Hamill, who had just purchased the Stanford Binet 6th edition. I co-created a panel with Bobby Gilman, John Wasserman, and Kathy Carney on fundamentals of gifted assessment for the Texas Association for Gifted and Talented in 2011. And I participated in a symposium on using the WISC-5 to locate twice exceptional children at another World Conference in 2013. So this one is the last one that we did. This was in 2018. And this was use of the WISC-5 for gifted and twice exceptional identification with Bobby Gilman, Sylvia Rim, myself, Karen Rogers, Dan Peters, Kathy Carney, and Megan Foley-Nickpon. And this was at the National Association for Gifted Children Conference in Minneapolis. And we were talking about the new position statement that NAGC had put out that we had written based on our research. And then this picture was taken at the end of Sylvia Rim and me were chanting no more full scale, because we were sick and tired of the full scale IQ score being used to eliminate gifted kids from being selected for gifted programs. I also helped orchestrate 2 national studies on the performance of gifted children on the WISC-4 and WISC-5. 339 children from 8 sites for the WISC-4 study, and 390 children from 7 sites for the WISC-5 study. There were 2 papers that were published as a result of this. One came out in Psychology in the Schools by myself and Bobby Gilman in 2020, and the other is in press now with Sage Open. I edited the book Counseling the Gifted and Talented, which was a Keystone Consortium book, in 1993, and it was adopted at 50 colleges and universities. It was the top-selling book in individual sales, and it introduced asynchronous development and Dabrowski's theory to gifted education. And this was the Keystone Consortium. John Feldhusen at the top on the left, Ken Seeley, that's Camilla Benbow next to John Feldhusen, Joyce Van Tassel Basca on the bottom, and I'm next to Joyce. So it took 7 years to create Upside Down Brilliance. And I had written the very first paper on it in 1989. And Upside Down Brilliance came out in 2002. It was published both in Australia and in the United States, and it sold 25,000 copies. We did an assessment that I'll tell you about later of visual spatial learners called the visual spatial identifier. But because of this visual spatial construct that I developed, both of the major publishers, Riverside that published the Stanford Binet and Pearson that published the Wechsler scales, incorporated visual spatial indexes into their IQ tests. And then the cartoons that Buck Jones created for Upside Down Brilliance got really popular all over internet. This is one of them where I talk about the auditory sequential learner being a filer and the visual spatial learner being a piler. I developed Giftedness 101 in 2013, and it has to date sold over 5,000 hard copies and a couple more thousand e-copies. It's been translated into Swedish and Korean, and now it's being translated into Japanese. It was designed as a crossover book to be used by professionals, parents, college students, and even high school students who were interested in what giftedness was all about. And I made a strong case that giftedness is psychology's forgotten child. I was one of the original members of the Columbus Group. We defined giftedness as asynchronous development in 1991. It's a phenomenological rather than a utilitarian perspective. It incorporates Dabrowski's overexcitabilities. That's what heightened intensity stands for. It applies to twice exceptional and underachieving students. It's not elitist. It's the only definition of giftedness that acknowledges the role of parents, teachers, and counselors. This is the original definition of giftedness as asynchronous development. Cognitive abilities and heightened intensity combine to create inner experiences and awareness that are qualitatively different from the norm. This asynchrony increases with higher intellectual capacity. The uniqueness of the gifted renders them particularly vulnerable and requires modifications in parenting, teaching, and counseling in order for them to develop optimally. If you'd like more information, I recommend the book that we created in 2013 called Off the Charts, Asynchrony in the Gifted Child, edited by Christine Neville, Michael Piofsky, and Stephanie Tolan. It won the Legacy Book Award for Scholars. It's the official publication of the Columbus Group, tells about the origin of asynchronous development, why our Columbus Group was kept a well-kept secret for 22 years. It provides the theoretical and research basis of asynchrony, gives concrete suggestions for parents and teachers, and it contains the last writings of Anna Marie Roper and Betty Mextra. Anna Marie developed the oldest school for the gifted that's still in operation in the United States, and Roper Review. And Betty Mextra wrote Guiding the Gifted Child with Stephanie Tolan and Jim Webb, which was an award-winning book, one of the first to come out on the gifted in the United States. And the construct of the visual spatial learner was developed because I saw that there was a different type of learner than the schools usually teach to. And they needed to have understanding in the schools. So the first paper was in 1989, and then we created in 1992 a visual spatial learner study group to create an instrument that could be used in the schools to identify visual spatial learners and give them validation. I published Upside Down Brilliance in 2002, and I was invited to give more presentations on the visual spatial learner than any other topic. I counted 138 in 8 different countries. And then in 1998, I helped create the visual spatial identifier. So I'll tell you a little bit about that. This cartoon is from that chapter in Upside Down Brilliance about the identifier. We were talking about in our group how in the US it was common to have children in different reading groups in first grade, and they would give them names like the bluebirds, the squirrels, the antelopes. And of course, the kids always knew who were the poor readers and who were the good readers. But these are the indications that came out of the visual spatial identifier, which is now a validated instrument that's used in school. And there's a Scantron sheet, and you can either individually fill it out at our center and find out to what degree your child is visual spatial, or a whole classroom of students can take it at the same time. So their dislikes public speaking, thinks in images instead of words, is a good speller, but that one is in reverse because visual spatial learners are not good spellers. Does not budget time well, resists demonstrating what he or she knows, has trouble with time tests, has neat handwriting, that's another reverse one, that's a not, is extraordinarily imaginative, takes things apart to find out how they work, is frustrated with writing assignments, solves problems in unusual ways, oral expression is much better than written expression, reaches correct solutions without apparent steps, is well organized, that's another not, because gifted visual spatial learners are very bad organizers. And we found that gifted girls did not memorize their math facts easily if they were visual spatial. So that was a not. The other thing I developed was the Giftedness in Adults rating scale. And we didn't develop reliability and validity on it like we did for the visual spatial identifier, but other people did. In 2007, they found high internal validity and convergence validity, and a doctoral student who developed her own rating scale developed the convergence validity. And then in 2016, a group in Malaysia studied individuals who had attained bachelor's degree, and they found that scores on the gifted adult rating scale predicted creativity on the creative personality scale and higher ethical judgment on the post-formal thought scale. So here are some examples, not the whole thing. Are you a complex person? Do you thrive on challenge? Do you love ardent discussions? Do you search for meaning in your life? Are you unusually compassionate? Do you have strong moral convictions? Are you very curious? Are you perceptive or insightful? Do you have an extraordinary sense of humor? This is Paula Prober, who wrote one of the best books on gifted adults called Your Rainforest Mind. And she's also come out with a guided journal called Saving Your Rainforest Mind. And I highly recommend this for gifted adults. I was lucky to be able to co-author Overexcitability Instruments under the helm of Frank Falk, the Overexcitability 2, the Overexcitability Inventory for Parents, the first edition and the second edition, the Overexcitability Questionnaire 2 for children, and a responsiveness scale for executives. Counting these 5 measures, I created or co-created 49 instruments to measure different facets of giftedness. And it's around 36 videos, and I frequently make new ones, like now. So this is basically my philosophy. What is child-centeredness? Have you ever been really seen? Not for your potential, not for what you do for others, but for who you really are. Child-centeredness is an I-thou relationship with a child, which honors this unique individual's equal rights, personal qualities, feelings, ideas, preferences, learning styles, and interests. From a child-centered perspective, childhood is not preparation for life. It is life. Every moment of a child's life is precious. Instead of being valued only for what they can produce, the gifted need to be cherished for who they are and the unusual ways they think and feel. Thank you.